Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the latest edition of the Woke Bros. Of course, I'm your co-host, Big Wos, aka Wosny Lambre, and I'm joined by, of course, my brother on the west side of Los Angeles, Nando Vila. But we got a special guest today, Nando.
Yep. Yep. We needed
Nando, don't
we
sound so
needed
excited.
we needed to expand our representation on this
Absolutely,
podcast.
because we wanted
Yeah.
to talk about the Jews.
The
Dun dun
Jews.
dun. We had to get our token Jewish friend Daniel Bessner. Of course, you know him as a history professor at UW. You know him from American Prestige. You know him from having worked on the Bernie campaign on the foreign policy side. Just from being an all-around mensch. You know this guy. You see what I did there?
That was
You,
good. That was very good one.
you know this guy, and so welcome to the show. And yeah, we're gonna get into Kanye and anti-Semitism at some point in the show, but I wanted to start off with this brouhaha between the progressives in the Democratic Party and a letter that they sent. Basically, like as Nando was saying before, they weren't even saying let's try peace. They were just saying like, can we like pivot to diplomacy, maybe, possibly, since like it's our job as the progressive wing of this party to like give voice to these ideas, like ostensibly like the liberal party in this country. Like, yeah, like diplomacy can DB, like, I want to hear from your perspective, like what you saw happen, where these guys they send this letter, they get absolutely crushed, obliterated, get sent packing, running scared with their tail between their legs, and then they throw their fucking staff under the bus, which is just the most
Almost
ridiculous.
immediately. It was
It's
it was
it's
kind of
crazy.
beautiful.
So can
Yeah,
you like sort of parse what happened
sure.
for the
So I mean,
people?
I think you described it pretty well. There was a letter released by, the Pramila Jayapal led Progressive Caucus in the Congress, and it is effectively said, Ukraine has been going on for a long time. It's in danger of becoming what's called a frozen conflict, kind of a conflict that lasts forever, where there's no winner or loser.
Shit.
The most famous one is probably Kashmir between India and Pakistan, which has just been going on for decades. And it's
Wow.
just there's higher rates of violence at sometimes. There's lower rates. There's sort of an ebb and flow, and it looks like Ukraine might very well become that. So the letter was just essentially like, let's try diplomacy, and it was immediately retracted. Some staffer, an unnamed staffer, was quoted, I forget precisely where, maybe it was Political, saying that we did the world's softest trial balloon and were immediately, shot down. And it just really indicates that there's no real appetite or interest within Washington, D.C. for challenging the military industrial complex, the U.S. armament of the world, and I would argue American empire more broadly.
Yeah, this was really a remarkable disciplining effect, right? I mean, it showed just how power works, how quickly it can flex its muscle, and how weak even the like what could possibly be called the left in this country really is. I mean, that's really what it came down to, is that there was no alternative power source for any sort of critique of the mainstream policy in Ukraine. The other guys, they just have all the power, like literally all of it, and even people. 30 measly House Democrats who were, honestly, if you read the letter, it's the softest thing in the world. It's like, of course, we support the aid packages that have already been sent out. Of course, we support, the Ukrainian military, full stop. But maybe we should maybe possibly sort of maybe think about maybe possibly doing a little diplomacy to try to end this conflict. Again, restating that we support that Putin is a murderous dictator, and we support Ukraine to again the softest thing in the world. The reaction was unanimous. It was swift. It was and they caved just as swiftly and unanimously as the reaction was, because again, there is no alternative power source. There is no source of power that undergirds them. They're just guys and gals,
Mhm.
you know
They don't
And
have some movement behind them, right? Like
nothing.
it's not like if it was evangelicals, say, within the
Right.
Republican who were like, yo, stop this war on the basis of Jesus. Like there's an institution there. There's people that are part of that institution. Like it's a block of people. Like, no, we're an entity that you can't really you can't just jerk us around like that. You can't
Right.
just treat us like a nothing burger. Like this is an actual institution with an actual constituency of people. The progressives, like you said, are just people who are in Congress.
Yeah.
And particularly when it comes to foreign policy, this is an issue area that's been really outside of any sort of democratic impact for a long time. The statistic that I like to use, and listeners might or might not be aware, is that the United States has actually not declared war.
Hold on, Danny. I want to just
Sure.
unpack what you just said for people that don't understand. When you say this is outside of democratic impact, meaning no matter who gets voted in, who's in charge, who's like, it doesn't matter what the people vote for or who gets voted in. This shit is
Right.
intractable, right?
Right. So, and just to exactly, because according to the Constitution, the U.S. Congress is supposed to declare war when the United States does things like fight wars. But the United States Congress has not declared war since 1942. And of
Right.
course,
Wow.
famously, the United States
Jesus
has been in
Christ.
Korea, Vietnam, Iraq,
Yeah.
Afghanistan, right? So
Grenada.
yeah, Grenada. There's even like yeah, there's a lot of those, overthrowing the leader of Iran, overthrowing the leader of Guatemala, Allende in Chile. So these are all, of course, one might reasonably consider some form of war or violence, but Congress
Mhm.
has had no say. So what, people might think of it as the literal American state, the institutions that make decisions like the Department of Defense, the CIA, the National Security Council, they're basically not subject to the
AKA the
democratic
deep
will.
state.
Yeah, right.
The
Some
deep
have called
state.
this the deep state, the foreign policy establishment. And that doesn't even get into the
The blob.
unofficial organs, right? Like think tanks, which are like
Mhm.
quote unquote private, but effectively work as the research arm of the American state. So, yeah, it's not great. There's not much control we have.
And I want to get into, because when we say people came down on them, the power came down on the progressives for even floating a letter that kind of suggested that there was an alternative to just flooding this place with a bunch of weapons and fighting until fucking kingdom come. Who is the sort of counter to these measly 30 bitch ass progressives in Congress?
Well, I mean, everything. It's the entire power structure, capital writ large. You know what I
Mm,
mean? Especially the sectors of capital that are interested in this particular conflict and in just the ongoing conflict in general, which usually is defense contractors. Just to be reductive and simplistic about it, but basically the forces of capital. Big money that has an interest in this, and then everything that flows from there, from politicians, other Democrats, like Senator Chris Murphy came down really hard on them, and members of their own party, and then the organs in the media that respond to the whims of capital, whether consciously or subconsciously. That's just how it really works. I mean, I was reading Marcos Mulitsa's tweets. Do you know who Marcos Mulitsas is?
no idea who is that.
He was the founder of something called the Daily Kos, which in
Okay,
the early
I remember that.
2000s, yeah, in the early 2000s was like a kind of considered a progressive blog network, I guess, that really challenged a lot of the establishment Democratic Party. But he's now just fully absorbed within that power structure of the Democratic Party, and his tweets were just like very indicative. First of all, the line of critique was like, this is also what these progressive caucus members actually want is the same thing that Marjorie Taylor Greene wants. So, if Marjorie Taylor Greene wants it, it's bad. You know,
It's,
so that's the
mhm.
first one, and then the follow up. I mean, just shows just how ridiculous the or how ridiculously unanimous the just all out war position is, and how bipartisan it is. He writes, in response to the letter, he goes, "This by Rep. Rashida Tlaib and Rep. Ro Khanna and other progressives is unbelievably naive and stupid, asking for, quote, diplomacy with a murderous terrorist regime literally raping and pillaging through Ukraine. Biden tried diplomacy to prevent war. Only overwhelming force will now end it. This guy was
Wow.
like made his bones, opposing George W. Bush and Iraq in the early 2000s. This is like now that's the position that's been absorbed.
Yeah, and it's important, man. And we talked about this the past few episodes about like when it comes to the media manufacturing the consent, like that's why it's important to get all moralistic about Putin, right? He's an evil figure. He's a cartoon character villain. We have to defeat villainy. These poor, helpless Ukrainians, even though, not to sound heartless, why should we give a fuck what happens in Ukraine? Like, like, this is not to sound fucked up. Like, how is that any of our business? How is this in any American's interest? Like, how is it like our interests impacted by what these people are doing over there? It's not. Whatever. But the media has to make this dude into the craziest, scariest, monster ghoul possible, right? And so that's the work that they've been doing. And then, to the other part of it that and I want to shout out to American Prestige for this, Danny, is I've been listening to your show and it's like talking about the history of the military industrial complex, and it's like, yo, these dudes don't have a reason for being. They don't have a purpose, right? The Cold War ended 30 years ago. They tried to do the shit like Kosovo or whatever, where like the military's used for like humanitarian reasons. That couldn't stick. We did the fucking war on terror, where like, we would put ISIS ripping dudes' heads off on TV and shit, and like, oh, ISIS, we got to get the terrorists. That shit doesn't stick. They're floating the China shit, which is just like, again, we can't go to war with China because we just be going to war with ourselves. Like, our fucking money is way too tied in with these people. It just wouldn't happen. Like, if the capitalists are telling our government what to do, they're not going to tell them to take down China. That doesn't make any fucking sense whatsoever. So like, China's a joke. And so they're just like, yo, hold on, man. This can feel legitimate. This feels nice. We're defeating evil in Ukraine. Pump in 40 billion, Biden. In another 2 months, give us another 50. Let's go.
And the funny thing to me is always that, like, particularly on Twitter, people act like they're these brave warriors defending Western civilization. It's just so humiliating. It's just they have no stake. They have no skin in the game. If they did, they wouldn't be doing this. And that's it's almost like Wos the best of both worlds, because you get to feel like you're a hero, that you're defeating evil, and you have absolutely no way of getting hurt yourself or anyone in your family getting hurt.
Yeah, the play it's just something that I call like World War II brain. The sort of conventional wisdom on World War II, and I'm not saying that's the wrong conventional wisdom, but it is the conventional wisdom that Hitler was on the rise, and the Western democracies, personified by one Neville Chamberlain in the UK, Prime Minister of the UK,
Limp-wrist liberal Neville Chamberlain.
did appeasement, and instead of like confronting Hitler early and fully and forcefully, and that's what led to the the historical crime of the Holocaust and 50 million people dead in World War II. And that analysis just gets transposed to every single conflict. It's like, well, you can't do appeasement. You can't be Neville Chamberlain. These guys, they're Hitler. They're murderous, psychopathic dictators hell bent on world domination. You got to do. I don't know. It just seems like incredibly childish to look at things on a case by case basis, to just see things with a one size fits all model. And Putin, who is a very bad man, is not Hitler. Just this is it,
Oh, that's crazy. What? Are you serious?
And more importantly, even if he was as evil as Hitler,
you're gonna do this with our Jewish friend in attendance? You're gonna say some heresy like that? What the hell?
How dare you, Nando? How
I
dare
know,
you?
I know. But like the thing is, even if you were Hitler, even if you were even more evil than Hitler, more deranged, more psychopathic, Russia doesn't have the state power or economic engine that the Germans had in the middle of the 20th century, or even today. Like Russia
Mm.
is a relatively weak country. Um, Again, it's been said a lot, but it's always remarkable. It's a smaller economy than Italy. And Italy is
Jesus.
a fucking joke. You
Yeah.
know, like this is not a hugely powerful hegemon that it goes to show that they were the United States intelligence services thought that Putin was going to overrun Ukraine in like 3 days, and like they weren't able to because they're shitty.
Mhm.
So even if you were as evil as Hitler, he just doesn't have actual power to back it up in the way Nazi Germany did. So it's just a ridiculous comparison or even mode of analysis.
Yeah, I mean, I want to get to this Kanye stuff, and so we could leave it there.
What's been
But
going on with Kanye?
Danny, man, I love talking to you about this stuff because obviously you're a self-hating traitorous Jew.
I say
Um
what Larry David says. I hate myself, but it's not because I'm Jewish.
Right. And obviously you don't take the tact of typical liberal mainstream people when it comes to questions of anti-Semitism, particularly here in America, right?
Yes.
It's
As a
important to
structural issue, I think is the way to think about it. Not that there's not incidents of anti-Semitism and individualized hate, that there are, of course, but when you're looking at sort of at the level of the population, when you're thinking about racism and in terms of politics, I think that's how you have to think about it. I don't take the normal tack that the Jews are like an oppressed population in the United States of 2022. I think the Jews are effectively, what one might today call white, that is in structurally white, participating in discourses of whiteness for the most part, for the lived experience of most, if not all, Jews in the United States. There are, of course, Jews of color. There are Jews who do not present as quote unquote white, and they are through that participating in structures of racism,
Yeah,
or
Black
are
Israelites. Oh
victims
wait,
of
no.
victims of structural racism, or in that sort of space. And that's a different thing. But so I just wanted to make myself clear. And we could talk about the history of that and whatever. But
No, that's what I
just
do
as a
want to get
starting point.
into because I think the Kanye thing opens that up, and I want to ask you seriously in earnestness, Danny, did you feel a way that I didn't put on my Instagram? I stand with my Jews and my Jewish friends. I support you and all of that. You didn't? Did you feel a way that I didn't put one of those posts up?
I did not. I didn't have people been put. I haven't seen anyone do that. I mean,
Are you?
maybe I
Well, it's the
self-select.
it's the friends that you have. None of your friends
Yeah.
are fucking
Yeah. No, I
crazy
haven't
and
seen. So that's
ridiculous.
like a thing. So
Oh
people are
my
like, I
God!
stand
What?
with Jews. Okay.
Yes,
Yeah. Yeah.
yes,
Yeah. Like,
yes.
okay.
I stand with my Jewish friends, which
Right.
means like,
Right. It's interesting because I think like on both sides there's some elements of confusion. Do you want me to get into that history of whiteness thing now, or
well, I
can I
just
wait?
want to
Okay.
foreground it because like Kanye comes out, right, and he's always like it's one of the classic like when you're off your meds or bipolar, you're like super paranoid. And classic internet conspiracy, the Jews run everything. The Jews are manipulating everything. The Jews, they look at them. They're the fucking CEOs at every single Hollywood studio. Look at, I mean, every single media company. There's a Jew on the board, and the blah blah blah, and the Jews, and these are the modes of influence. It's Hollywood. It's media. It's blah 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 blah. Right? Like it's the shit that I've been reading literally since I got on the internet. It's so old. I don't even know what to say at this point. This shit is corny to me. But I do want to get into sort of course, the history of American Jews and how we get to today, where the fact of the matter is, yeah, like there's a lot of prominent people in finance, prominent people who ran the Fed, prominent people, Hollywood studios, prominent people who own big media companies who are Jewish people. And I think some people would be like, well, isn't Kanye right? Don't the Jews run everything?
I mean, it gets into such a large topic. So just very quickly, I
Yeah.
think we're really, in some sense, talking about like which populations are white and which
Mm.
aren't white. And you saw this actually, if you guys remember, Whoopi Goldberg had a comment recently where it's like the Holocaust was against white people or something along those something
Yeah,
something
she
like
said it was.
that.
Yeah.
She basically said it was whites doing it to whites.
Right. Okay. So
How you gonna call it a hate crime
right.
if it's whites doing it to each other?
White
Right.
on white crime.
Right.
Yep.
And that's just because the who is considered to be white, which is what we mean by that, is really part of the dominant structural population in a country, has changed over the course of the 20th century. So I would argue in 2022, again, there are, of course, exceptions, but Jews are for the most part white. That wasn't true in 1940. That
Mhm.
wasn't true when we're talking about the Holocaust. Jews over the course of the 20th century, like other ethnic whites, previous populations that came here, like the Irish or the Germans, or more temporally close to the Jews, the Italians, have also over the course of the 20th and early 21st centuries.
I would say the fucking Cubans in Miami
I'll
are
leave that to
becoming
Nando
white.
to comment on the Latin X
Yeah.
Ted Cruz
population.
isn't white. Like
Right.
you're gonna tell me Ted Cruz isn't a white dude? That's impossible. You
Yeah,
Right.
he's
like
Canadian.
don't get much whiter.
Everyone
than
in Canada is white. No, of course not.
Right. So, Waz, what you're getting at is that like populations that at one point weren't considered white eventually do become considered to be part of the white population. So I think like that is what the type of discourse that Kanye is partially participating in, and that's also the type of the discourse that people who are posting things are also participating in. It's just where you fall along that perception of whether Jews are quote unquote white or not. I personally do. And we could get into the question about like why there seems to be Jewish overrepresentation in certain industries. I think there are people who have studied this at length, but my understanding is that when it comes to Hollywood, a lot of Jewish immigrants were literally the first people to start the Hollywood studios, like the Warner Brothers, because they were barred from more traditional employment in legacy industries like newspapers and journals. So that
Mm.
when people interested in media were able to do, which in the early 20th century, the movie business was. My understanding when it comes to things like finance is that that's mostly related to meritocracy, because traditionally Jews were actually barred from American banks. When you're from the 20s, my understanding, the
Yeah,
20s and
let's
30s.
slow down. Let's slow down quickly
Sure.
because when you
Sorry, I'm
say
too fast. Too fast.
no, because when you say listen,
Too much high level information, dude.
I have triggers because I know this is something that I had to learn. Like when you say meritocracy, you're not saying that the Jews got there because it was merited or they
Yeah,
earned
Brett's
like
Jewish.
how
He
we
No,
said that they're
no.
smarter.
there's an
It's a
actual
critique of
system.
meritocracy. Yeah.
Yeah. There's an actual system that we call meritocracy, right? Which is like you tested and
Yeah.
graded into Harvard and blah, blah, blah.
Right.
And now from Harvard, you get to white shoe law firms and you get to work at Goldman and you get to do whatever. That's the meritocracy
Right.
that we're talking about. Not that there's actually a system where the people who have the most merit get to ascend to these high level
Yeah.
positions.
Let me
It's
just
literally the system.
briefly. So there's a change after World War II where it's actually one of the big unanswered questions in American history is like, why did the WASP elite allow itself to essentially not be taken over, but to really diminish its power after World War II? It really did happen. The statistic I give, Yale, this meritocratic institution, didn't have a tenured Jewish professor until 1946, 1 year after World War II, 1 year after the Holocaust. So there's a shift after World War II where instead of, your dad was the right guy and then you went to, Andover and then you went to Harvard like George H.W. Bush or Kennedy, that was how you entered the American power structure. What happens after World War II is you get the introduction of a system called meritocracy that, Harvard's going to accept the smartest people, the people who do the highest on the tests, and they're going to, be the leaders of the country. And that's basically how, quote unquote, ethnic whites, Jews, but also to a large degree, Catholics as well, entered what might be called the American power elite. That's all I'm referring to. And that, I think, is mostly linked, my understanding, is to why you see Jewish representation in like white Jew law firms or finances. It's part of this meritocratization process. And you could say the same for other, quote unquote, ethnic whites who were considered not quite white
And then
before
you
World
can
War
say
II.
the same thing for Asian people, Indian
Today.
people. Today, like this is how they get to these spots.
Higher income per capita than even like white people.
Right. Like they go to Stanford, they go to Harvard, they go to Yale, and then they get these big ass jobs.
It I was thinking about like when throughout this whole Kanye thing, I've been thinking a lot about like a conversation that you and Mike had and had a few times about what Jay-Z had a chain some point.
Well, yeah.
Like, what is that
Jay,
whole thing, and why is that so popular amongst like black rappers?
because okay, so the Nation of Islam,
Yeah,
as you guys know, is an offshoot of actual Islam, or what I would
right.
call real Islam, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And it started by Elijah Muhammad in New York City, right? Like they're in New York, the tri-state area, New Jersey, Newark, those places, Harlem, all of that stuff. And one day, a dude named Clarence 13X, who was part of the Nation of Islam, he splintered off. There's a lot of reasons why they say he left the sect, but he was like, yo, I don't want to be down with the nation no more. And he started his own thing called the 5%er Nation of Gods and Earths, which is, it's just a different version of that same Nation of Islam shit, right? It's an offshoot, but that 5%er Nation, that shit proliferated all around New York City around the time that a lot of these rappers were growing up. So we're talking about the 70s and 80s. Like this shit was all over New York. It was in places like Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, Harlem, all of those
I
places.
remember it. Yeah, I mean, you obviously must have from being a kid.
Yeah, of
And
course.
like, what is it? What does it mean to be a 5%er?
5%er is this idea that there's like 90% of the people are lost. 10% of the people know what's going on. I think.
Did you
like,
ever watch Oz, the show Oz?
I never
Yeah.
watched that show.
Do you remember Supreme Allah, Nando?
He's a 5%er.
Yeah.
It's this idea that like 5% of them are the people with the knowledge are using it for nefarious needs, for nefarious ways, and there's another 5% of the 5% of nation who are trying to enlighten people and bring them into the light, right? And they basically teach you shit like the Greeks didn't invent the Pythagorean theorem. They got the fucking actual knowledge from the Egyptians, but we whitewashed the Pythagorean theorem. Like, it's like, how do you think the
Can
Egyptians?
I just add a quick history thing here very
Yeah.
quickly, because I read about this. It's really interesting because the Egyptian thing comes from the 70s. Like, do you guys remember like Steve Martin doing King Tut stuff?
Yeah.
Because I believe, if I recall, that King Tut goes on a world tour in the 70s.
Yeah,
So there's a huge influx of Egyptian stuff and Egyptian culture. And there's also like a sort of like a reaffirmation of 20s culture, which was also, because of Tut, was found in the 20s, like really Egyptian focused. Like even Ghostbusters is the hangover of that kind of. It's like a Sumerian deity. But yeah, there's a real spark of interest in Egyptian stuff in the 70s and the 80s.
Yeah, and it's this idea that basically the Egyptians, they would have had to know these fucking mathematical equations to build something like the pyramids, which is just way before Pythagoras, right? And the idea of the 5% is this sort of, it's a counter narrative to the sort of black pathology narrative that you get in America, that black people are lazy, dumb, don't know anything. That's why their plight in America is what it is. And what the 5%ers are trying to do is, it's the counter narrative. It's like, not only are we not lazy, we're fucking kings. We made the pyramids. Have you ever heard of Mansa Musa?
So they're calling like Egyptians black. Like it's like,
oh, of course. Yeah, of course. They're just owning that Africa thing. And not only that,
also a very 1970s thing, like the Pan-Africanism,
100%.
African nationalism of like Nasser and
Gaddafi,
shit,
that
yeah,
he was the
Gaddafi.
African Union, yeah.
And not only are white people not superior to us, they were grafted from pigs on the Greek island of Patmos 7,000 years ago.
Wait, so what does that have to do with the Jews?
A lot of 5%, a lot of Nation of Islam, the ideology is just like the Jews are not the actual lost tribe of Judah, like that it's actually these East African homies that are the real tribe.
Right.
Like that the Jews took that with white Jews, or what they would call white Jews, took that from the real lost tribe of Judah, the real people, chosen people, which again are black people. Like
Yeah.
it's
It's
just
awesome.
this, it's a counter narrative to what you get about black people, especially coming out of civil rights and American apartheid, Jim Crow, all of that kind of stuff. Like if you really get into it, a lot of it is pretty kooky. Like if you get into Nation of Islam stuff, it's kooky. But I will say this. Because there was like a time in my life where I was like super interested in 5% of shit,
Yeah.
ideology and all of that. Not that I wanted to join, but just learning what these people actually believe. And the 7,000 years ago shit, like that's a thing that like an evil scientist invented white people out of whole
Is it
cloth.
Yakub? Is it Dr. Yakub?
Yakub,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yakub,
yeah, yeah.
Yakub,
Yakub, yeah.
yes.
Yakub, yeah. It's also related
And
to this Arabic, this interest in Arabic in this. It's very interesting. Yeah.
it's on the Greek island of Patmos, invented white people, breeded them to be hyper aggressive, and all the evil
That's
things
awesome.
that people now associate with white people, honestly. And National Geographic put out some new founding, and it was like essentially the first German like fossil that they could find is from 7,000 years ago. And the shit essentially like popped up. They have no explanation as to how the Germans got there
Yakub, dude. Yakub. Wait,
7,000 years ago. Isn't
wait.
that
And so what's the
insane?
deal? What's the deal with the Black Israelites? Because I remember when I was a kid and I went to New York City for the first time by myself. I went to a Pearl Jam concert when I was like 15 with my friends. And I remember we just stood there for like 2 hours being yelled at by the Black Israelites in Times Square, I think it was. We were just like, what is going on? And I've never like what is who are
So
why the thing?
they're the ones that actually, like, I think 5%ers don't think they're part of the lost tribe of Judah or whatever. I don't think that's it. I think Israelites are people who actually do believe that they are descended from that lost tribe and they are God's chosen people and not the Jew people, the white people who call themselves
Right,
Jews nowadays. But I do want to
right.
get back to the white Jews of America, if
Sorry.
we can, because I
Yeah.
know Danny has to go soon. And so, like, to your ear, fuck what Kanye's saying. Just the way that we are trained to deal with anti-Semitism in 2022. Like, what's your analysis of that, especially on the liberal ledger of things?
Well, I think it's basically, not following the first law of historical materialism, which is
Mm,
eternal now and forever, which is that you have to look at the circumstances of 2022 and what structural position given populations find themselves in. So it's going to me, I think it's going to be very difficult to, prevent stochastic instances of violence, like a shooting at a synagogue or random
mhm.
instances
That's
of
not a thing we could ever
anti-Semitism.
stop. Yeah.
Right, but when you're talking from a structural level, I don't think Jews suffer from structural oppression. So I think that that has to be the starting point of any analysis that one is doing. I think to be frank, I think that a lot of the people who get upset about this are really the first generation after the Holocaust, and so they
Mhm,
they grew up in a particular historical moment when the Jews had suffered
mhm.
an incredible genocide, and so they're sort of their radars are always kind of going. I think as we get further and further away from the living memory of the Holocaust, it's already not even a living memory. It's sort of like people who knew the people or were close to the people who survived it. Then you'll see less and less arguments about structural anti-Semitism, which I think.
I want to ask you something
Sure.
that I've heard a Jewish homie posit to me before. It's this because, like, I think part of the discourse too is how a lot of American Jews think of their identity as being part of this bigger story of Jewish people through the centuries of just like, you know, we were, there was this time in Spain where we were really comfortable.
Thanks,
and everything was and everything was going really great. And then they fucking turned against us. And then there was that time in Italy. And then there was that time in France. And then there was that time over here. And then there was the fucking German fucking Holocaust, right? And like there's this grander narrative that stretches back throughout the centuries where like, a Jewish person of a certain, ideology might say to me or you or Nando, like, no, we're part of a long history of constantly being hated on.
Right.
And just because we're good right now in America, right now, and God knows y'all ain't never been this good nowhere else before. Just because we're good right now in America, we are damn good, it always feels tenuous. It feels fleeting. What do you say to that analysis?
Things could feel whatever you want them to feel. I think you actually have to analyze it. And I think the situation of the Jews in Europe, which admittedly culminated in the Holocaust, and in Europe is essentially, I think what Hitler called Judenrein, Jew-free. Europe is effectively Jew-free. He succeeded. But I still think that the situation of Europe is just fundamentally different from the United States. But I think the United States is really built on the two oppressions of indigenous genocide and the enslavery of people of African descent. And I think the Jews coming to the United States, for the most part, in the late 19th and early 20th century, just occupy a different space. This is not to say that there's never instances of anti-Semitism. The Leo Frank case in Georgia, a famous instance of really vicious anti-Semitism. It's not to say it doesn't exist, but I just think it's fundamentally different than what was happening in Europe. That's what I say to that. I've had those conversations myself.
When there's the ease to which you can create an out group to scapegoat, right? In Europe, in the 1300s,
well, Jews were part of the structure of Europe, just like people of African descent were part of the structure in the United States from the beginning, kind of.
No, totally. My point is that because Jews were kind of the one minority in a lot of European countries, and it's not uniformly true, but like the Jews were kind of in these otherwise relatively homogenous countries, Spain notwithstanding, that when things go wrong and you need an out group to define, to sort of blame and scapegoat, they were kind of the ones there, whereas in the United States in 2022, or even since the Jewish migration to the United States in around the turn of the century, there was other groups that were much easier to define as the out group. I mean, most importantly, Black people. But yeah, so
and that's what you're getting at. You're getting at the structural element, which again has to be the lens that we use when we're talking about this.
And that's what I want to speak to. Like, Danny, we had you up here because I wanted to get to the Jewish part of this Kanye thing that blows up, right? And I want to speak to the Black part because I'm here to tell you, as your resident Black person on the Woke Bros, a lot of Black people are obsessed with the Jews. And it's for the reason that y'all just stated. Like, the Jews seem to be a people who were made an obvious other. Like, these people were the niggers of Europe, right?
Yeah.
Like, they were an out group. They were outcast, castigated. They were the enemy of the power structure. And slowly but surely, they've become one with that structure in a way that Black people don't think that they are, but let me tell you, there are Negroes participating in it, but whatever.
Barack Obama's just about to buy the Phoenix Suns, that's how you know you've made it,
But again, there's just this idea that the Jews have got it together. Like, how did they do this? That's the eternal question for so many Black people. It's like, how did they achieve this? How did they go from being holocausted to goddamn killing it all across the board? Like, there are no Jewish projects. There's no Jewish neighborhood that would mirror some Black spot in rural Mississippi. You know what I'm saying? Like,
the term ghetto is from Italy, right?
Of course.
To refer to the Jews, yeah.
Of course. But what the Black people say is like, that shit don't exist nowhere in America. And people want to know, like, how do Black people get there? And a lot of Black people think whenever you hear the term group economics. It's the old anti-Semitic that, well, the Jews, a dollar doesn't leave the neighborhood, at least until it touches another Jewish hand 7 times or some shit. Essentially, I don't know, group racial
This is
capitalism.
New York stuff. I haven't heard that one in like 20 years.
Bruh, group economics,
This
it's
is-
like
yeah.
so ridiculous. It's this idea, if I just keep buying Jay-Z champagne and I just keep going to the black baker and that's gonna bring black people out the slums. It's so ridiculous, but that's what comes out of that, right? Like this Kanye shit is a result of that. Like I really do feel like a lot, especially prominent blacks, they have Jews on the brain because every single place they turn, every ladder they climb, they're meeting Jewish people all the time. And it's just like, how did they do this shit? And Danny, you so beautifully put it, they're white. they accessed whiteness. It's really not that hard. Like they got to access whiteness at a time that no black people could. They got to
right place, right time. Right place, right time.
Yeah, they got to access whiteness back when it really mattered. Back when in the 1940s, being white really mattered. Like being black really did have a really huge determinative factor in your life. Just being black. Like, yes, in 1840 something, being black was highly determinative. Like, yeah, like, yo, once you're black, boom, here's your path. I'm sorry, y'all, in 2022, that ain't the fucking case. It's just not. I don't know what to tell these motherfuckers.
What was is this our pilot audition for The Ringer, where we're gonna
oh yeah, the
30 episode series on black Jewish relations?
Danny wants to pitch a pod to The Ringer where we break down
bridging the divide. Yeah.
Well, because the Jews and the blacks used to be divided. That was a big part of one of the anti-Semitic like talking points. Was like, they're riling up the Negroes. The Jews, that's all they're here to do. They're riling up these Negroes. That's all they want to do all day.
There's also the Great Sopranos episode that touches on like the history of Jews, like on
in the
record companies.
That's the worst Sopranos episode. A hit is a hit. That's one of the worst episodes ever made.
It's
probably the worst Sopranos episode. That or the Columbus Day episode. The times that David Chase tried to deal with identity did not go well.
Yeah, not great.
But the Columbus Day episode has been memeified, so therefore it's a great episode.
Well, yeah,
the Furio.
And it's funny because it's like David Chase, the Italian guy who changed his fucking name so that people wouldn't know he was Italian. Like talking about identity, like that's, there's something there, of course. But yeah, man, I'm just happy we had this episode because, like, I really do, because like. I was talking to somebody yesterday where I see a bunch of black people on the internet talking about, well, when Kanye said slavery was fake and blah, 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 Harriet Tubman ain't free no slaves, this and this and that. Slavery's a choice.
That's a good case.
Like all of this stuff that was like, oh, anti-blackness doesn't get you. I'm like, but he's black. Like if he was Jewish saying all this shit, I think there would be different consequences for a Jewish cat doing this than a black dude. Like when you're black, you can be anti-black in public. Yes. People will pay you to do so. That's the thing. But I do think a lot of those statements are rooted in anti-Semitism, of just this idea that, like, the Jews are just like, they're just so controlling. And the crazy thing is, like, I don't give a fuck. Kanye's like a 500 millionaire at this point from sneakers, and he loses his deals. Who gives a fuck? I don't give a shit.
You could sponsor the pod.
Yeah, come sponsor it, Kanye. I'll take your sponsorship dollars. I will say this. Him getting canceled for this is like feeds right into the anti-Semitic like tropes and ideas. Well, you know what I mean?
The real thing about the Kanye thing is that, like, I find it hard to take too seriously, and I find people who do take it very seriously just kind of unsettling.
Well, Reese Witherspoon said her Jewish friends' families are now in danger because of it.
Well, he's just clearly going through like a mental breakdown. Yeah. All right. Well, Danny's got to go.
So Danny's got to go. Thank you for the time, Danny, the expertise, the knowledge. You're always making us smarter. Of course, shouts to my man John Gervais on the boards. Become a Patreon, patreon.com/Count the Dings. Support all the great shit we're doing here at Woke Bros and all over Count the Dings. Danny, tell these people where they can get your great work. I'm an American Prestige. Not even Patreon no more. Y'all Substackers now. So I'm on your Substack. I'm all over this thing.
The
Thanks
dangerous.
so much. Yeah, we're
Substackers.
we're heterodox thinkers. Yeah, so if anyone wants to check it out, American Prestige, foreign policy, history stuff, and if you want to follow me on Twitter at @dbessner.
All right, we'll see you guys next week. Peace.